It's April 2nd, 1976, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
The fate of pinball itself hung in the balance today in history in 1976, when 25-year-old journalist and pinball wizard Roger Sharpe pulled off the perfect pinball shot in the unlikely venue of the New York City Council chamber, his aim to demonstrate that the ban against pinball machines in New York on the basis they were a form of gambling should be reversed, because clearly he had skills.
Yeah, and Sharpe was an editor at GQ magazine. That was his day job. And you can imagine that was probably, something that the Amusement and Music Operators Association had hired him sort of partially on that basis, that he had a bit of media clout. But he was also a well-known pinball aficionado. And so he was the person that had been picked to come into the chamber. There was actually a little bit of jiggery-pokery when he came in, because there was a pinball machine set up in the middle of the chamber. He went to start to play that. All of the reporters and photographers were gathered around, because it was a bit of a novelty story. And just as he was about to play it, the councilmen were like, not that one, this one. And there was another pinball machine in the corner. This actually annoyed the press corps because they had to set up their lights again. But the sort of gist was that they were trying to see if the game was somehow rigged in some way, which it wasn't. And when Roger Sharpe stepped up, he was supposed to be proving basically that, we'll get into it, but that the fact that you had the flippers on the pinball machine meant that if you could manipulate them with sufficient skill, you were more likely to win. Therefore, it was a game of skill. But in the end, he actually didn't have to play the full game, because he pulled back the plunger at the side of the machine, the one that kicks the game off. And he said, look, if I do it in this way, it's going to go straight up and straight down the middle. And he pulled back the plunger at a certain angle. It went up, straight down. And apparently that was enough to convince the council to vote unanimously to lift the ban on pinball.
And you can see in a funny way how some of the very early pinball machines would have looked much more like gambling than the ones that we've ended up with flippers at the bottom. But pinball had been under attack in New York in particular for a long time. By 1933, after Prohibition ended, reformers and temperance advocates found basically a new target, and that was pinball machines. And Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who was elected on an anti-gangster platform, initially cracked down on mafia-run slot machines, and then when mobsters just went ahead and replaced all their slot machines with pinball machines, he then launched a campaign to outlaw pinball as well, because there was also a small cash payout to winners, and there was sort of this slight moral panic over young people bringing their nickels and dimes for lunch money and then losing them in the pinball machine. And so that was a form of extortion in its own right. And then, like, LaGuardia's anti-pinball crusade gathered even more momentum after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when he argued that pinball machines were a waste of wartime metal. And he said this stuff should be being used for bombs rather than this ordinary everyday waste of cash. And then he actually rounded up pinball machines, smashed them down, and then passed on the scrap metal to the war effort.
Yeah, it was a brutal crackdown. He used to gift people the legs of the pinball machines that he'd broken as trophies for their involvement in smashing the gangs. But, that reference to Pearl Harbor really underlines, doesn't it, just how long this ban had lasted. At 34 years, the longest ban in gaming history, according to Guinness World Records. And you're right that before flippers came to pinball machines, they did look a bit more like basically bingo cards with numbers under glass with holes where the balls would randomly drop. And, if you were betting, as particularly during the Depression, people had on the outcome of these games, then they were being operated by some of the same people as more nefarious practices, and it wasn't a game of skill. You could sort of understand how he wants to be elected on a strong platform to protect our children, and this became the kind of 1940s equivalent, before the war started and they had actual things to worry about, of a kind of social media ban for children. This is going to corrupt our kids' minds, don't let them give their money to the gangsters. And there's also, I think, maybe some sort of anti-Chicago, New York versus Chicago rhetoric going on as well. I mean, to be fair, Chicago was a hive of criminality and gangsters at the time. And what LaGuardia is saying is the pinball machine was invented in Chicago by David Gottlieb. The gangsters based in Chicago are punting these out all around the country to lure in our teens. I, as your mayor of New York, are going to stand up to these guys.
Yeah, and a lot of the panic around the pinball machines reminded me a lot of our episode on jukeboxes. There were lots of similarities where it reached this huge mainstream popularity in the 30s precisely because it was kind of a cheap thrill for the Depression era audience. But that then pushed operators to make them flashier. You know, they had lights, they had buzzers and bells, they had these big, colourful, illustrated scoreboards at the end. And I can definitely see how, to parents, it was almost like fruit machines. It seems like it's made deliberately to be alluring to children, you know, and to young people. And much like the image of, you know, there was, if you think about like The Music Man, right, that's set in 1912, and there's a whole song about Pool and all of the moral decay it's going to bring to River City. Pool had its own moral panic, and then that was sort of grafted a little bit onto pinball, and the image of the sort of shady pool shark was seen as something that was happening around pinball machines as well, that there were all these shifty characters who were luring children into these colourful machines, parting them from their money. And in fact, there was some truth to this. Again, similar to the jukeboxes, the mafia did the distribution and operation of a lot of pinball machines, and they were making a lot of money.
And I think also couple with the idea that once you criminalize these things, then they're forced into like sex shops and, you know, underground bars and those sorts of places, then there is this sort of self-reinforcing thing where people go, oh, well, that pinball machines are in these bad places and bad people play them, and so they must be bad. But I think that there was this comeback beginning even prior to this moment in New York, because I don't know if you guys know this, but this amazing film from 1975, which was a film adaptation of The Who's rock opera album called Tommy, and it told the story of a psychosomatically deaf, mute and blind boy who becomes a pinball champion and religious leader, and it looks like the absolute trippiest thing in the whole world.
Have you not seen it?
I'm so confused. It's like you're describing it to us like you're just describing the lyrics to Pinball Wizard as though we're going to be blown away by the plot of Tommy.
Call yourself a British immigrant.
But it also did push pinball back into the cultural spotlight, and you already had a recognition that maybe criminalizing this particular game was a bit of overkill in cities like Los Angeles, which had been a stronghold of pinball prohibition. The official ban was lifted in 1974, and I think that opened the floodgates to other parts of the US and areas that had long thought this is something we need to control, changing their attitude.
Yeah, but I mean, so overdue, it's absurd, because the argument that adding the flippers made the game a game of skill rather than a game of luck could have been made 30 years earlier in 1947, when David Gottlieb from Chicago, the guy that kind of popularized pinball in the early 1930s, then created a game called Humpty Dumpty, which was the first to have flippers. It had 6 flippers. A guy called Steve Kordek in Chicago in 1948 then introduced the pair of flippers at the bottom, because that was cheaper to do, obviously, than making 6. And suddenly every pinball machine had flippers on it. But they still have this ridiculous law where it's sort of technically illegal to play pinball, this thing that, as you're saying, is this massive hit, like with a big song by The Who and Elton John. And Sharpe, the guy we're talking about who on this day was playing pinball to demonstrate that it was a game of skill, he was a real aficionado. He'd written the book on pinball. He'd played every game that had ever been built since the 1960s. He was the designer of a game called Sharpshooter a couple of years after this in 1978, which went on to become massively popular and was even exhibited at the Smithsonian. So popular was this game as the kind of perfect example of pinball. And he laid down in an interview that I read what the kind of design principles of perfect pinball were. Players should win a free game about 25% of the time. Each game should last 2.5 to 3 minutes, and each ball should last 47 to 48 seconds. So that's the kind of granular, like, design detail that people like him now had around this culture. It was a sport to them more than just a game. And so, of course, it's completely ridiculous, the idea that it would be illegal to play it.
Well, and the decision on this day to legalise pinball in New York City, which sort of set off a wave of liberalisation of pinball machine bans across the US, kind of represented a full circle, really, because pinball in its original form had been a game of skill. It started life in the 19th century as sort of a novelty game based on the older game Bagatelle, and that involved using billiard cues to shoot balls into holes on a table, and some versions involved fixed wooden pegs that you were having to avoid. So if you were playing that, and there were versions where you just rolled the balls with your hand as well, it was actually a game of skill at its beginning. And Pinball, the sort of drugstore saloon version that became popular in the US, was played instead of on a table in a sort of small glass cabinet that could be on a countertop, mounted on a tilt. You'd have nails or pins, hence the name, driven into the board to send the ball off different directions, make the game more exciting. And the earliest versions, this is where it started to become then a game of chance, is that the earliest sort of commercial versions had this spring-loaded plunger, and that's all you had. Just pulled it back to shoot the ball, and the ball went wherever it did. And it was a very basic bar game, like Pub Skittles or something like that. It wasn't coin-operated. It wasn't really a machine. It was just a glass cabinet. It was in the 1930s that more operators started offering cash prizes, and that was what started to make people feel quite uncomfortable.
That old chestnut, the longest pinball marathon. I have the answer. Would you care to guess how many hours someone has uninterruptedly played pinball for?
I'm going to say 12 hours.
Oh,
Yes,
no, way more. It'll be like 500 hours. There's no limit, right? This is how long you can stay awake.
It was broken in 2023 by Andrew Robishaw from Lakeland, Florida. 62 hours, 21 minutes.
Wow.
Playing a Stranger Things themed pinball machine, apparently.
My God. Was he deaf, dumb and blind by any chance?
I don't know, but he may have disappeared into the wall and gone to another dimension and just not realised.
Tomorrow.
Managed to ride this contraption for several miles, only stopping when the seat caught fire.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.